Hi guys, it's Kirsty. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about pure OCD. So I'm going to be talking about what may be classified as pure OCD within the OCD community, some of the beliefs about pure OCD, about treatment and why it might be different. I'm also going to propose some arguments as to why it isn't so different, and some of the problems with referring to it separately as pure OCD that I've personally found. But before I go into that, I'd like to ask, please do subscribe by clicking on the subscribe button below in order to stay up to date with new videos as they're released. So I wanted to make this video because the type of OCD that I have suffered with would be classified perhaps under the heading of pure OCD amongst in regards to sort of within the OCD community and by maybe some professionals. And the reason I particularly wanted to discuss this is because of the way pure OCD, the idea of pure OCD made me feel about my chances of recovery. But before I go into that, I would like to talk through some of the kind of themes that may be classified as pure OCD. So pure OCD would be defined as being without the obvious compulsions. So, for example, contamination OCD would not be coming under pure OCD because quite often there's sort of some kind of cleaning or hand washing compulsion, which may make it maybe more easy to diagnose, perhaps. Not pure OCD would be checking compulsions as well. So checking things like switches, checking doors, etc. Those themes that may fall under pure OCD might be relationship OCD. It might be OCD surrounding your sexual identity, whether that's who you're attracted to or how you might identify as yourself, i.e. Like trans OCD, for example. Some of harm OCD may technically fall under pure OCD, but some of it might be actual OCD in terms of if they're hiding knives, then that's a more obvious compulsion. And then in terms of somatic OCD, I suppose that would potentially fall under pure OCD as well, as would OCD like solipsism and sort of OCD themes where you're starting to, existential themes where you're starting to question, the meaning of life, etc. So those are some themes that may be classified as pure OCD. And the reason they would be classified as pure OCD is because the compulsions are not considered to be super obvious. However, there are compulsions. So it's not kind of completely pure obsessional, as it could sometimes be described. Not only are there mental rituals that may go on with these themes, for example, rumination, analysis, checking how you're feeling about certain things, and playing scenarios in your head and checking your feelings about them, or replaying past events and kind of going over it. So firstly, there are compulsions which can go on internally, but also I would like to say that there are outward compulsions as well that can come with some of these themes too, such as confessing, asking for reassurance, compulsive Googling and researching, avoiding certain people, certain places, talking about certain topics. So there are compulsions with these, which I think sometimes is one of the first things that can cause misunderstandings when we talk about the idea of pure OCD. There are compulsions. And even once you've cut out the obvious, the outward compulsions within those, like the researching, the Googling, the confessing, the reassurance seeking, we are often left with the internal compulsions that are harder to kind of switch off until we've worked on beliefs surrounding the fears, until we've done more of the cognitive part, and perhaps, done some of the exposures that may be suggested to us by whoever we're working with on our OCD for those particular themes. So personally, some of the things that I read about pure OCD that made me feel quite negative and afraid when I was suffering at my worst. Firstly was the fact that it's harder to diagnose, and I would have to agree with that in my experience, because one of the main themes that I was suffering from was ROCD. And I was definitely reassurance seeking, confessing, Googling, and doing some avoidance as well, in terms of avoiding watching certain programs or listening to certain songs. But it wasn't recognised with me when I went to a kind of a top mental health hospital. I was diagnosed with panic disorder and depression. So I would be inclined to agree with that. Which isn't ideal, but quite often, with OCD, with it being quite misunderstood, that's quite common for some of us to go without diagnosis. And I think sometimes it's good to just keep going until you get that diagnosis, even if you're doubting the fact that you have OCD. Just know that that's a hallmark of OCD itself. It's the doubting disease. It makes you doubt everything. And at the core of it is you doubting that you actually have OCD. And then the other thing is that I read about it that was quite, off-putting for me, and probably kept me locked into a fear cycle even more, was that it's harder to treat. Now, having learned more and more about OCD and how it presents itself in different people and how the themes can change, I would be inclined to disagree with that, because I have known people who have suffered from contamination OCD, and worked through that, doing exposures and working on their core beliefs, their beliefs that are keeping about the fear levels up. And they've started to come through that contamination, only to find their theme switching to OCD, where maybe you're doubting your sexuality, or harm OCD, where there's less obvious compulsions, and they're the types of OCD themes that would technically fall under the umbrella of pure OCD. So it's not like that person has two different types of OCD. They have OCD and pure OCD. It's just one OCD. But it flipped to a different theme. And then that person would maybe then start working on the core fears that are driving that theme. I think the argument that it's more difficult to treat probably comes from the fact that mental compulsions are some of the hardest to start shifting as we work through our recovery. But with this, I think that's probably the case with contamination and checking as well. Even if somebody isn't washing their hands or checking things, or, doing obvious compulsions, it doesn't mean that they're not still ruminating under the surface and that the fear levels are really high. So I would, in my opinion, I would have thought that, those mental compulsions might be in place for another person who has more or obvious compulsions, as much as somebody who has maybe mostly mental compulsions, but with, may have done some kind of reassurance seeking previously. So I think, what it comes down to with OCD, that can help us, is that OCD loves to complicate things, and it loves to make things seem scarier. And the term pure OCD can feed into that a little bit, because we could feel doomed, because the word pure, like that, it somehow makes it more sort of this thing is pure, it's more dangerous and toxic for us. And it can make it seem a lot worse to us, and that recovery is going to be harder for us, and that, we're going to have to be that bit more careful. And that can be problematic for us, because many of us will have experienced, as we start to work on bringing our fears down of our core kind of OCD themes, our OCD will often then switch to our recovery, because it is hard living with OCD, and we do want to recover, and we can quite often find ourselves being afraid that we won't recover, or that we're going to go back to square one. It's that fear of fear, essentially. And I believe that the term pure OCD sometimes can feed into it if we don't take it a little bit with a pinch of salt. Obviously, you know, it can be maybe useful in identifying certain themes where the compulsions are less obvious, but I think that it would be useful for us as OCD sufferers to use the term loosely, and also not to be afraid of if we have been labelled as having pure OCD, because we can choose to not listen to, you know, some of the fears that come with it. Oh, because it's pure OCD, it's going to be harder to treat. If we just stick to the idea that OCD is a fear cycle, we're trapped in this in a way, you know, we feel stuck because we're terrified of something and we're trying to prevent this thing from happening, or try and take away any uncertainty and know for definite. Whether, you know, no matter what our compulsions are, that's what we're doing. So there's a fear that's driving that. If we identify the fear, you know, then we can start bringing the fear levels down, start reducing compulsions. And I'm not just talking about the sort of overt compulsions, you know, the behavioural compulsions in terms of, you know, reassurance seeking, Googling, confessing, washing hands, washing surfaces, washing all things. I'm talking about also the mental compulsions. Once we've brought the fear down, we will start to gain a bit more control over mental compulsions, whether that's rumination or mental checking, because some of that can run, it can almost feel like it's running quite automatically because we're so terrified of something. But once we bring that terror down to concern kind of level, we strongly don't want it to happen, but we're no longer absolutely petrified of it, we'll gain a bit more control over those mental compulsions. I just want to be clear here, though, that I don't want to sound like I'm oversimplifying OCD recovery, because it's not easy, OCD recovery. It's not easy having OCD. But what I'm suggesting here is that we don't need to make our recovery harder for ourselves by latching on to terror at the idea that our OCD is pure OCD rather than OCD. It's all OCD is what I'm trying to say. And if we can, as I say, treat the classification of pure with a slight pinch of salt, and sort of don't buy into the idea so much that it is going to be much harder to recover from, it can really help. You know, like as I said, OCD loves to complicate things and add, you know, layers of kind of analysis onto things and look for opportunities to take us down further rabbit holes, whether that's, you know, mentally going over things, or if that's compulsively researching or asking for reassurance. OCD will present us with more kind of bait for us to chase after, and the idea of pure OCD and that it's going to be harder to recover from, that is more bait for OCD to go after. And it may be just maybe referred to as being hard to recover from because the mental compulsions are quite often the last compulsions that we start to kind of reduce, because, as I said, because of the, you know, anxious thinking is quite quick and it's fast and it's hard to kind of step in there and stop what's going on. But once we reduce the anxiety, we can slow down the thinking a little bit more. And that's when we start to gain a bit more control over our mental compulsions. So, yeah, I hope this video has been useful in terms of kind of talking about compulsions that do still take place, even if our themes do fall under the pure OCD umbrella, and you know, just giving some of my opinions about my own experience with how it was affected diagnosis for me, but that it took in turn for me. The fact that I would be classified as maybe having pure OCD hasn't, I don't believe that I've recovered reached recovery any slower than somebody who had more obvious compulsions, because themes change in OCD and it comes down to core fears that are keeping us in these cycles. So, you know, really, once you strip away the details of the compulsions and the presentation, the theme, it's fears that we hold on to at the core of it that keeps it going. And OCD uses different themes as the things to get our attention, and the compulsions are then what we do to to prove this thing wrong or to stop this thing happening. And just because the compulsions are not the obvious ones, it doesn't mean that they're not compulsions. And if there are compulsions, it means that if we work on exposures and working our beliefs surrounding it, we can start to reduce them and cut them out, which will help to reduce the fear cycle and bring down, the obsessions and the fear surrounding the subject. So, as I say, I hope this has been useful in terms of kind of offering my views on the idea of pure OCD, why it's not necessarily as scary as it might sound, and why you shouldn't let it throw you off course in terms of, your recovery and seeking treatment. But thank you ever so much for watching, and take care. Bye.